Welcome to ZKast, everyone. I'm Zscaler from ZK Research, and I'm here for another one of my thought leadership ZKasts. Today, I'm joined by Deepen Desai, the CISO and VP of Security Research at Zscaler. Deepen, obviously, given your title, we're going to be talking cyber. Before I get into this, though, I do want to give a quick shout out to eWeek. eWeek is my media partner, and all ZKasts are done in conjunction with the eWeek eSpeaks program. So, Deepen, before we start, why don't you just give us a little bio about yourself, what you do, what Zscaler does, and what your role there is.
Hey, thank you, ZS, for having me here. Hey everyone, my name is Deepen Desai. I'm the CISO and head of security research here at Zscaler. My primary role is to make sure our platforms and services are secure, and then I also have a group of world-class researchers, which is ThreatLabZ, responsible for tracking threat landscape and ensuring protection for our customers against newer threats. Yeah, so Zscaler offers world's largest security cloud that we call Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange. This is an integrated platform of services that protects users and workloads using identity and context to securely broker user devices. It could be workloads over any network from any location. With Zscaler's Zero Trust implementation, you secure the users, applications, and data rather than the network.
Yeah, I've actually been following Zscaler since when it was founded, and I think it's been pretty interesting to see the impact you guys have had on the industry, because I think what Zscaler has done for security, what I think AWS and companies like that did for general computing, right? It's much more agile and much more scalable than it's ever been. So that's been interesting to see. Now, you did talk about the ThreatLabZ team that you have. Can you describe the group? What's its main responsibility? How's it structured, what it does, and then what are some of the trends that it's seeing right now?
Yeah, so ThreatLabZ team, for those of you that don't know, it's basically the security research arm of Zscaler, which includes over 100 security experts located in 7 different countries across the globe. And the main job is to track the evolving threat landscape and, as I mentioned, protect thousands of organizations around the world that goes through Zscaler's Zero Trust Exchange. Now, the way we have it structured is we have tactically aligned ThreatLabZ team across 4 critical stages of the attack chain. And the goal here is to have the right expertise in place for breaking that attack at multiple levels. So let me double click on those 4 groups, right? So the first group that we have is focused on the initial delivery vector, where the attackers are trying to gain entry into your environment. So this team proactively tracks phishing campaigns, drive-by attacks, any kind of compromised or malicious sites where that attack starts, right? And they use data from Zscaler Cloud as well as other intel sources for the purpose of making sure we're able to keep up with that delivery vector phase. The second group is responsible for vulnerability exploit coverage. Right? Now, we all agree that patching is important, but there is always a gap between a patch becoming available and getting applied to the systems. And that's usually the window of opportunity for the attackers. So this group in ThreatLabZ reduces that window by adding detections to give time to the organizations that are going through Zero Trust Exchange to apply those patches. To give you an example, we're part of Microsoft Active Protection Program. There is a MAP Validate tier, which is one of their highest tier. And that allows ThreatLabZ team to gain access to Microsoft, Adobe vulnerability detection guidance almost 5 weeks in advance of Patch Tuesdays. So this program basically allows us to ensure vulnerability exploit coverage for Microsoft, Adobe vulnerabilities on the day they release security updates, and making sure that all our customers are protected. Now, the third group is responsible for malware coverage. So if you think of the attack chain, they start with that initial delivery hook. They will use some sort of weaponized payload where a vulnerability exploit is being used to compromise that endpoint. Then there is usually a malware involved where, again, the goal is based on the objective of the adversary. They're trying to steal information, or it could be a ransomware. So this third group of ThreatLabZ is focused on that malware tracking stage, and they're tracking both crimeware as well as more targeted malware families. We leverage AI ML models as well as world-class automation to process large volume of malware payloads, extracting configurations from these payloads automatically, and then adding coverage across the cloud. So one of the stat that I'll share that when I talk to this group, it's just fascinating, right? The number of unique payloads that Zscaler sees in our cloud sandbox is 500,000 every day. These are net new payloads. I'm sure most of you guys listening to this have heard about VirusTotal, right? That sees close to 2 million new unique payloads every day coming from all kinds of users that are subscribed to it. So there's no way you could manually, go about adding coverage. So this team has developed a lot of good automation using clustering technique, AI ML model. I mentioned config extractors where we're able to pull the CNC configuration from these payloads automatically and then add the coverage to Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange. The final group is focused on the command and control stage. Right? And the goal over here is to track the attacker controlled infrastructure, ensuring coverage for that command and control activity. So what happens when a machine gets infected? It will try to communicate with the attacker's server, which is the CNC server, using a predefined protocol, right, in which it will send command, receive response, update itself. So again, this team has reversed many of those malware families CNC activity protocol, added coverage for it, and they've also developed a cool automation where we are able to emulate that activity, giving us access to a lot of real-time intelligence that again gets added to the product for blocking. Now, the final point I'll make over here, which really gives ThreatLabZ an edge, is the team has access to the massive insights from Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange. So on any given day, we're securing over 240 billion transactions. That results in 7 billion policy violations and security blocks. And that represents like trillions of signals that the team is able to derive in order to study what's going on the newer campaigns, targeted attacks, and that intelligence is further used to kind of improve the efficacy of our platform.
Yeah, I know a lot of businesses used to try and do this type of research themselves, but as you mentioned before, just the volume of data has gotten so high that you really can't do it manually anymore. In fact, I think because of that, I've been a long time believer that tools like SIMs and things have to be completely rebuilt because they just they can't keep up. Now, you talked about some of the interesting trends from ThreatLabZ. The other side of security, of course, is the monetization of the breaches, which leads to ransomware, right? So ransomware is a huge topic in cyber today. What's ThreatLabZ telling you about ransomware? Why is it as successful as it's been? Why is it working, and what can companies do?
Yeah. So yes, I'll talk about the overall trends that we're seeing, and then we'll jump into the ransomware. Right?
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Over the past 2 years, we've seen a dramatic shift in the way the organizations operate due to pandemic. Early on, it was more remote workforce. Now we are into a phase where there is this hybrid work environment. The employees could be remote, could be in the office. The applications and workloads have mostly shifted to public and private cloud infrastructure. And
I'm glad you brought that up too, because one of the interesting aspects of remote work is prior to the pandemic, there's people like you and I that work remotely. We're pretty sophisticated technically. You kind of understood how to troubleshoot things. Now we're sending, contact center agents, inside salespeople, marketing, people that have never worked remotely before, and they don't have the same level of kind of security acumen as people that were professional road warriors. So I'm glad you brought that up because that's been a big change. So sorry to interrupt you though, but I thought that was worth noting.
No, you hit the point right on the nail, right? That is the reason what we started seeing since 2020 itself, and that trend has continued. Cyber criminals were keeping a close eye on this shift in the way organizations are operating, right? And early on, many of the organizations were left vulnerable because they were not able to support large remote workers, whether it's because of the lack of infrastructure that was present. Most of them were prepared to support 10 to 20% of the remote workforce, not 100%, right? The VPNs couldn't scale. Then we are in this hybrid work environment where the employees may be in the home environment for some time and then in the office environment. How can they reduce the risk? So what we saw in terms of security trends is there are three major buckets where many of these attacks were being planted by cyber criminals. The number one was, as you mentioned, targeting those remote employees. Not all of them have the security acumen to spot some of those spear phishing emails or drive-by download links. So those remote employees are more susceptible, and they're being hit by fairly targeted phishing attacks and drive-by attacks. And the goal over here is just to gain that initial entry into the victim environment. The second group of attacks, this is part of the three bucket trend that I'm talking about, is where as organizations started supporting these hybrid work environment or large remote workforce, they also had to move a lot of their internal applications and workloads to public cloud infrastructure, right? And that's where it's not as easy, right? There were a lot of configuration mistakes, and threat actors were continuously looking out for that, right? So as simple as an open S3 bucket to exposed SMB services or any of the vulnerable services that were left out because of a misconfiguration. The threat actor would go after it, gain entry into the environment, and steal information in many of the cases. And then the third category of attacks is where they're basically targeting your exposed assets. And think of remote VPN servers, like VPN concentrators that has to be exposed to the internet because you're trying to support your remote workforce. Exchange server, we saw Log4j vulnerability exploit, right? So any server that had that vulnerable library, again, was massively being hit. We saw more than a dozen nation-state threat actors targeting these exposed assets like VPN server. Right, so that was another big bucket where we saw the threat landscape evolve. And again, the goal over here is to gain access to the victim's environment. Now, this trend has been seen, like I mentioned, both for crimeware, which are more financially motivated adversary, as well as more targeted attacks where generally espionage or even hacktivism could be the goal, right? So we saw both nation-state threat actors as well as crimeware actors launching attacks in these three buckets. Now, you asked about ransomware, right? So yes, ransomware continues to be one of the more prevalent threat. And despite a lot of law enforcement and government crackdown, we continue to see more and more ransomware attacks even now. And the reason is, if you look at it, what has changed over the last 3 years, even on the ransomware TTP side, like tools, tactics, procedures that the gangs are using, they've noticed, like if you think of 2017, there were WannaCry, NotPetya, Bad Rabbit, the large global scale ransomware attacks where they were targeting mass number of organizations, encrypting data and demanding ransom. The new thing that happened back then was they weaponized the payload to move laterally using exploits like Eternal Blue. Next few years, all the organizations became prudent in terms of backup hygiene. So even if they get hit by some attack like that, they're able to recover from it, and it's business as usual, filling in the obviously the security holes that was used to get in. 2019 onwards, we started seeing advent of double extortion attacks. So where they started, they will get inside the environment, they will hit one of the endpoint, they will then move laterally within the environment, they will identify all high value assets that are sitting in their environment, right? There's this internal recon stage where they will identify your code-based server that may have financial details. They will even try to find out whether you have a cyber insurance policy. How much money do you have as part of your balance sheet? Right? What level of coverage do you have? And then that is what they will use to demand ransom from you as well. The high value assets that they've identified, they will steal data from all of those assets before encrypting your entire network, right? So now, even if you're able to recover from your backups, they will threaten to leak that stolen data, which is why the term double extortion. And that's where many of the organizations are forced to pay that. So the team actually has been tracking many of these ransomware gangs, and we just published our annual report, the 2022 Ransomware Report by ThreatLabZ. And there were many of the, I can quickly go over the key findings.
Yeah, I did see that report. I thought it was a really good report. In fact, I'll include a link to the report in the description of the YouTube video here. So, but I was really surprised at some of the findings in there. So if you could go through some of those, that would be great.
Yeah. So ransomware attacks, we have seen an increase by 80% year over year. And one of the reasons for the increase was also increase in ransomware as a service model.
Yeah.
If you look at the top ransomware families, 8 out of top 11 ransomware families are leveraging ransomware as a service model, which essentially makes it very easy for relatively non-technical guy as well to kind of rent this infrastructure and launch attacks.
I mean, anyone can launch a ransomware attack now, right? It's pretty easy to do. And Bitcoin gives you a perfect payment mechanism. So
exactly.
Yeah.
We also saw certain industry verticals being targeted more than the others. So nearly 1 in 5 ransomware attacks targeted manufacturing industry vertical, making it most targeted industry in last 2 years. Healthcare, as well as, as we start getting back to normal, the restaurant and food services industries also saw a significant spike in ransomware attacks when you compare it to last year. One of the trends that we saw, I mentioned about how ransomware families continue to evolve their TTPs. I wouldn't call it, well, we could call this a TTP as well, as where as the law enforcement and government agencies are cracking down and blocking certain ransomware groups, they will come back with a new name, right? So we've seen more than 5 different families rebranding themselves. So it's almost identical code base, just new name, new infrastructure, right? That way, the victims are still able to pay that ransom and gain access to their data. The other trend that we notice is supply chain ransomware attacks. They are basically increasing the damage that is inflicted by these attacks, as well as it also is shifting the focus on the end party that you are relying on. So the example that I can give you is, and we mentioned this in the report as well, is where a third party that a large organization depends on. So the large organization, parent organization, is very good in terms of their security posture, but a third party that has sensitive data about the parent organization for business purposes is being targeted by a ransomware group. They manage to exfil data from that third party, and now they're going after the parent organization for paying ransom, right? So these type of in-party attacks, we will continue to see more and more, where these guys are just trying to make money by targeting the entire supply chain. And then geopolitical conflicts, Russia-Ukraine war, we saw a few ransomware attacks around the start of that conflict. It's fairly common to see many other geopolitical regional activity also being used by these threat actors when they launch some of these ransomware attacks.
Yeah, now I did see some of the ransomware data that indicates a large percent of companies simply pay the ransomware. But as you pointed out, right, there's been a rise in this double extortion. So a lot of times when you pay the ransomware, it doesn't actually solve anything. So what are you seeing companies doing to try and protect themselves from ransomware? What are they doing right and what are they doing wrong? Right.
So look, if you simplify the attack chain, the way I look at it is, their first goal is to identify the victims, right? They're trying to find your assets that are exposed to the internet. The goal is to hit that first endpoint. So first stage is they will try to discover your assets that are exposed. Second stage is where they will attempt to compromise one of your asset or one of your endpoints. So it could be one of your server or even public cloud infrastructure that I mentioned. The third stage is where they will attempt to move laterally within your environment. This is one of the most important stage because the difference between a single machine being infected versus your entire environment going down, it's huge, right? And I'll double click on how organizations can safeguard at this stage as well. And then finally, thereafter, your data, right? As I mentioned before, encrypting your data, they're also stealing it. So the way to look at it when you are trying to come up with your security architecture, the first goal is to eliminate your external attack surface, right? Reduce your attack surface. If they can't see you, they can't target you. So Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange using Zero Trust architecture significantly reduces your external attack surface. There's no external VPN server concentrators and that the threat actors can attack in this case. The second stage is preventing that compromise. The reason many of the organizations struggled initially, and some of them are still in their journey towards this digital transformation, is ability to enforce consistent security policies, no matter where your users are, right? Shouldn't matter whether your user is working in a home environment, which is considered relatively insecure, or they are within the office. You should have ability to apply consistent security policy with full SSL inspection. Otherwise, it's a blind spot. When the user is in the office, you have a world-class castle and moat security architecture. But when the user goes out, you're now relying on the fact that they're VPNing in for security. So having that consistent pane of glass, enforcing inline security engines, and with technologies like sandboxing, browser isolation, right? The goal is to make it extremely difficult for the threat actor even to hit that first endpoint or the first workload or server application with an attack. So that's one point. The other point where I see some of the organizations struggle is many of them that I speak with may have like 10 best of breed products, right? But they're not talking to each other that well. So the team is actually doing hand holding. And in many of the cases, like especially ransomware attack, once a payload goes through, you really, I mean, if 10 minutes later, your engine comes back and say, hey, this thing was bad, take action, it may already be too late, right? Because the speed at which these guys are able to encrypt files and exfiltrate data is amazing. So need to have inline security engines that are working together in disrupting these type of modern attacks.
The third, you had mentioned a couple of like sandboxing things which fall in the broader category of deception technology. I know this is an area that Zscaler has recently gotten into. So can you talk about that and then kind of double click on the value of the deception technology?
Exactly. And that was actually the third stage, right? Where once they hit your initial asset, the goal for the threat actor is to move laterally within your environment, right? And when you think about it, you should ask the question, what is my blast radius if one of the user endpoint is infected by a malware, right? Can the attacker reach to my crown jewel application? Can they move laterally within the environment to other endpoints, right? So that is something that you should have a clear picture. And the way you reduce that blast radius is by implementing user to app and app to app microsegmentation. And then that's where Zscaler Zero Trust Exchange, the Zscaler private access piece of it, really helps our customers to achieve that secure remote access from your user to the application without actually bringing user on the same network as the application. So that's one. The second one is, as you mentioned, deception, right? So we made an acquisition last year, and we're very far along in our integration journey. Where what we have done is we're integrating deception as yet another engine that will help reduce that blast radius, as well as block that insider threat activity or the compromised user activity at the time the attack is happening, rather than alerting after it has happened. So a quick overview of that is we have endpoint deception, where we're using the same agent to perform deception on the endpoint. Think of secrets being planted at tactical places where threat actors or some of these malware families are known to look for sensitive information. Then we have application deception. Using the same Zscaler private access model, we now have decoy farm that is projecting as real application to your end user. So if there is hands-on keyboard activity or that lateral propagation attempt, it may very well end up in our decoy farm, and you're able to take action as soon as that happens. So if user Zeus ends up trying to access a RDP port of a legitimate application on one fine day, we'll redirect him to a decoy farm and cut off all access to internal critical applications. So stopping the attack at that time, alerting the SOC team, who's then able to remediate whatever the infection may be on the endpoint.
Thanks for that. So that's an interesting way to, I guess, protect yourself against ransomware without actually, by, I guess the easiest way to think of it is luring the threat actors into, going after what they think is my corporate environment, but it isn't, right? So that's, it's been used to some degree in other elements, but now you're trying to apply that, the difficulty that is ransomware, which is getting even harder.
Exactly. I mean, if you think of it, deception has been there for some time as well. But the point I made, as yet another point product, managing it is not always easy. So our goal is to make it one-click option, integrate it with your existing deployment, and then it's an entire platform that's helping you out. Right?
Yeah, that is an interesting trend I've seen too, because I was talking with a CISO recently that I guess a light bulb had gone off in his head, where he said that now he's starting to realize that best of breed everywhere doesn't lead to best in class threat protection. In fact, it leads to suboptimal. And now that security is moving to the cloud, the ability for a company like yourself to aggregate all that data, do some analytics on it, and then be able to find the insights in that, you're going to get better insights than a company trying to pull data from 10 different systems or 20 different systems or sometimes 100 different systems, right? And then try and do the analytics themselves. So. Exactly.
And like I mentioned, you need to have that full visibility, and that's where the platform approach has really helped us. Yeah. So, by the way, as I mentioned about external attack surface, prevent compromise, prevent lateral movement, and then we also solve the final piece of the puzzle, which is where when those ransomware operators are trying to steal your data, we are able to perform inline DLP with full SSL inspection, right? And again, the goal over here is to apply that consistent data loss prevention inspection for all data that leaves your endpoint, as well as your server assets or your workloads that are running in the public cloud. The goal is to make sure you're preventing that data exfiltration attempt as well, whether it's those ransomware operators or nation state threat actors.
All right. The last question, Brett, since you do work for one of the companies, the industry's biggest security providers, and you yourself, I consider a thought leader. What are some cybersecurity predictions you can give us for the remainder of this year and going into next year?
Yeah, I always get asked about that. So I'll name a few. One of the prime ones, and this is on top of my mind as well, right, is supply chain attacks. We will see more and more attackers go after supply chain attacks. The supply chain vector used to be associated with nation state threat actors back in the day. But over the last couple of years, we have seen that change. Even the crimeware gangs are leveraging that. They haven't used it efficiently, but we anticipate that to change over the coming years. The other piece that we see is the whole as a service model, right, that I spoke about on ransomware side. We also saw a similar trend leading to a spike in phishing campaigns, phishing as a service model, right? So these as a service threat model will continue to proliferate. More and more gangs will take advantage of it, and it will basically allow even a non-expert to conduct large-scale attacks. We will see threat groups leveraging the rebranding phenomena, right? The trend that we're seeing on the ransomware side, it will happen in other categories as well. And the goal is to get around the government and regional crackdowns. And then finally, insider threats. I mean, the LabZ playbook that we saw targeting Okta, all organizations should seriously have a look at how they will detect and respond to a similar playbook, right? And that's where having those tabletop exercises, having a response plan in place will be very important. But the prediction over here is growth in the insider threat use case as well, where some of these gangs will adopt LabZ playbook to target some of the large organizations.
All right. Well, Deepen, so insider threats will probably be a good way to end this. That was a fascinating discussion on ransomware, on protection, deception technology. So thank you for your time. On behalf of Deepen, I'm Zias Caraval from ZK Research, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to click to subscribe. I'll also include the link to Zscaler and some of those reports I mentioned down below. So on behalf of Deepen, thanks for watching, and see you next time on ZKast.